Hello everyone, today we talk about the Duchy of Aquitaine, existing fundamentally from the beginning of the 7th century approximately until as probably an independent polity, but already quite depleted of autonomy, as we will see, the very end of the 100 Years' War. Right, this was a historical fiefdom in western, central and southern areas of present-day France. Bear in mind, we talked today just about the feudal thing, right? So the polity as such. Then at some other point we will talk further about medieval Aquitaine, or made something about Occitanian in southern France in general. Here we are on essentially the left bank of the River Loire, right? Covering an immense area, actually, because the Duchy was, as we will see now, just the core heartland, and then, feudally speaking, lots of other counties were added, and or the authority of the Dukes of Aquitaine extended over a very larger amount of territory than just the Duchy itself. An extent, in fact, it fluctuated greatly over the centuries. Right, I made already a video about the Duchy of Gascony that at times was within Aquitaine, but was somehow escaping it. As we will see now, there is quite a political gaming, especially with the northeastern, probably French monarchy that was, especially large times of the early Middle Ages, absent from the area, and so most of course, the recompaction of at least what was Western Francia administratively would occur in the late Middle Ages, with great struggles against the Aquitanian rulers. So Aquitaine, the Duchy of Aquitaine, had emerged, as we've seen in the 7th century, as part of Francia, broadly meant, or at least those territories that were considered as owned by the Franks. By approximation, it was not a Frankish heartland. As you know, since Caesar's Commentario de Bello Gallico, you know that Gaul was divided in 3 parts, and one of that was occupied, in fact, by this the southwesternmost one by non-Celtic peoples, or at least Celticized populations by a degree, but that retained an important identity on their own. Right, in Roman times, Aquitaine was fundamentally encompassed by the provinces of the Aquitania Prima and Secunda, and recognized as such as, a country on its own. As a duchy, it would break up, as we will see now, after the conquest of the independent one of Vaiofar, essentially in the mid or third quarter of the 8th century, being incorporated essentially in the Carolingian Empire as a subkingdom on its own. This is also interesting because normally the Carolingian subkingdoms corresponded to some other kind of migration era country people that had been remaining like that. Aquitaine instead survived, in a sense, as a bit of a thing on its own, albeit there was a very strong Visigothic influence. In fact, that had been historically the first era in which the Visigoths, as you know, had been settling on the Garonne before moving, after they were crushed by the Franks, finally shifting their major center of power from Toulouse to Toledo. Just a brief note, when you hear Aquitaine talking about, for example, Toulouse, which often happens, this is not really correct, right? This was yet another part, right, that would emerge, and I made a video about the county of Toulouse as such. It was all different counties, different polities that didn't correspond quite to the originary Aquitanian land, at least in Roman times, right? That was from the Atlantic side of the watershed. From the Mediterranean one, you have Toulouse, etc., which is also a substantially different area. Many people say, "Oh my God, Aquitaine was so Romanized, and that's why it clashed with the Franks. Telling you the truth, it's not correct, right? The Narbonenses, the part of Septimania, made a video recently about even Catalonia. It, of course, had been Germanized to an extent, superficially, but they were some of the most strongly and intensely Romanized areas in Western Europe. Aquitaine was historically something else, no doubt. It had cities, it had been Romanized and all, but it was different from that. And the name of Aquitaine attributed to Toulouse is mostly in part due to the fact that, yes, as we will see now, the duchy encompassed that area later, but it mostly stems from the late antique provincial repartition at the time of Diocletian that fundamentally incorporated, simplifying things a bit, the lands of Toulouse to Aquitaine as such. Just a little note, have to remember not to make excessive confusion. Then Aquitaine, after the as you know, the subdivision, the partition, say better, of the Carolingian Empire at Verdun in 848 fell to into Western Francia, and fundamentally is consolidated as a duchy after that, right? In high medieval times, this land autonomizes, and rarely, right? It's not until essentially the 12th or 13th century that the Capetian monarchy of the Western Frankish kings manages fundamentally to retake control of large swaths of Occitania, right? And so for a long time, the land was a bit of a thing on its own, historically, notoriously, right? There is a bit this stereotype that the northern French were the incredibly rigid, stern, cold, brutal, imperialistic, feudal-minded northerners as Franks, right, and more Germanic in nature, and Aquitaine instead was more the Teutonic, more female inclined, southern, warmer, kind of more promiscuous too, more urbanized, more sensually based because of eroticism and songs, etc. On the other. Of course, there is a bit of that, telling you the truth, but there is also a lot of intersection there. Today we will not talk much about Aquitanian culture as such, right? But it's somehow fascinating to look at what was really essentially the most important polity in southern central France, say south of the Loire, say southern France. And it was very composite in nature as well, right? The areas of Toulouse were somehow different from the ones of Auvergne and, same Poitou, Aquitaine, Gascony. There is the county of La Marche, Limoges, Périgord. These are all the names of the territories encompassed by Aquitanian power, right? And it really acts as a different country, right, as the ones that existed before the process fundamentally of French national concentration / imperial unification, you can argue. And we will see this now. The name of Aquitaine naturally is also very famously connected to all the Plantagenet parabola. Most of the Angevin Empire was actually, the English Angevin Empire was made up of the lands ruled over by the Duke of Aquitaine, that at some point were in fact also kings of England. I made videos about Angevin England, so there the thing is explained fairly well. We will, in depth at least. Today we will briefly look at that too, of course. By the, say, this was triggered naturally rivalries between England and France, right? And it would be essentially the last major territorial possessions of the English in France. By the mid-13th century, only Gascony, in fact, remained in Angevin hands, after the Battle of Bouvines. The 100 Years' War triggered further clashes, for which part of this territory that is sometimes called as the Guyenne, is also a base of English power, somehow detached from the rest of that point of the effect of the English crown's possessions. However, still relevant and with an important strategic function, because from there, as you know, many chevauchés were launched into the French heartland. The Kingdom of France would regain control fully over Aquitaine in the 50s of the 15th century, with the end of the 100 Years' War, the French victory, which led also to the direct incorporation of the land in the French royal domain itself. Right, so it would become a land possessed directly by the kings of France. So the Gallia Aquitania fell under the Visigoths in the early 5th century. These were the lands that, as you know, the successors of Alaric had been given essentially as federati through the Hospitalitas contract by the Western Roman government just after the plundering of Rome. It was a relatively decentralized area, right? Even though, again, it was southern France, let's say southern Gaul at that point. Actually, the most Romanized places were from the Mediterranean side, right? Then, surely the Visigoths took control also of the southern parts, but the very first area was, again, in the Atlantic Valley, right, of the Garonne. So there, simply the Visigoths substituted themselves to the local army. The 1/3 of the land actually means that it were actually even more land than that they could seize, but that's essentially, and that was the most important thing, the amount of tributes that they could levy in order to maintain their own army there, right, as a field one practically. And so we will see perhaps the history of Visigothic Gaul a bit better, because the Visigoths did leave a very strong influence in these areas throughout all the Middle Ages, culturally speaking, even when they were wiped out by the Arabs, right? In fact, actually, southern France was very connected with the Iberian Peninsula even during the Islamic rule, and we will see it better. But it was also a frontier area between the northern, the Frankish north, and this other kind of more southern dimension. Aquitaine was conquered properly by the Franks under Clovis I in 507 as a result of the famous Battle of Vouillé, in which, in fact, the Visigoths were destroyed and obliged to move their center of power further south. They would have just Gothia/Septimania left, a strip basically of the coast of the Occitanian coast from the Mediterranean watershed. That was also pretty autonomous from Toledo anyway. During the 6th and early 7th century, Aquitaine was under direct rule of the Merovingian kings as a consequence. And it was divided at some point in the struggles that were arising among the ruling dynasty that, as you know, treated basically the entire Merovingian possessions as a purely private asset to dynastically split here and there according to the Germanic rule that wouldn't accept, say, a brother taking less than the other. As a result, as you know, the Merovingian kingdom or empire split in different chunks, and Aquitaine was an important one of it. That, however, was arguably also the one that profited the most from this political fragmentation, as it had substantial power to essentially grow as an autonomous power, legitimately on its own. This wouldn't happen basically for any other chunk of the Merovingian the Merovingian Empire, except that the Frankish heartland, properly of Neustria and Austrasia, right? But it wouldn't happen to the Burgundians, to the Alemanni, etc. Aquitaine was divided, for example, between the realms of Childebert II and his nephew Guntram, in the Treaty of Andelot of 587. Under Clotaire II, Aquitaine was reincorporated under at least a single monarchy. However, after Clothaire's death in 628, his heir Dagobert I granted a sub-kingdom in southern Aquitaine to his younger brother Charibert II. This in part already shows the divides that historically, culturally, and politically existed between the say sub provinces of Aquitaine. And again, was a very complex and large and varied land. In fact, the aforementioned sub-kingdom consisted, we've seen it in the video about the Duchy of Gascony, in the latter country, right? Plus the southern fringe of Aquitaine proper, right? That is conventionally known as Aquitaine and forms the historical basis of the later duchy. So we're talking about Angoulême, Bordeaux. Those are basically the areas. In the north of Gascony, it was actually considered like a different country, different people, something else. In fact, there are very interesting kind of cultural intersections there, but the far south remained somehow as a frontier area and also as a particularly militarized one, mountainous one, a different place, right? Aquitaine was vast, rich, agricultural. It had important cities, this important river basin, and it arrived up to the Loire. In fact, that was mostly dominated as a course by the Neustrians in the north, but was also making the consistent fortune, at least of many Aquitanian merchants, etc. So the Charibert also fought successfully against the Basques, that were this riotous population of the south. The important mechanism there was asserting the authority, let's say, showing that the Franks had the upper hand still on the Pyrenees as opposed to the Visigoths, right? In infiltrating there was much factionalism locally, from which, in fact, also Gascony began to emerge as something that could play both sides, but mostly being hegemonized by the Franks. They were the strongest. After Charibert's death in 632, the Basques revolted again, and the aforementioned Dagobert I sent an army that subdued the Basques in 3 years after. At the same time, the Merovingian king was forced to deal with a rebellion in Brittany. So again, this was not a time in which a Frankish king would get bored, because again, the objective was to reconquer a bit this vaster area. I also made a video about medieval Brittany, which showed you how autonomous such a land could remain, even when being quite close to the Frankish power heartland, right? For many reasons. So it's fair to say that in spite of the Frankish appointment of local officials, let's say royal relatives and so on, of course, the Duchy of Aquitaine was a quasi-independent realm, right? And this trend accelerated, especially in the second half of the 7th century. That was basically the moment, in fact, of greatest Merovingian fragmentation. Basically, it wasn't a sole Frankish kingdom, there were 4, right? And Aquitaine was a bit defiled from this. By 700 AD, the famous Odo the Great was ruling the duchy. The first duke on record under the name of Felix had been ruling from about 660, right? So that's the moment at which more or less the Merovingians had loosened the grip compared, or even before, like from a century before wasn't like a major control, but still an effectively decentralized one. At this point, instead, Aquitaine started developing properly some political ambitions on its own. Again, it was a region, right? A massive, in fact, territorial power that could carry out some interesting, also political and military activity on its own, independently, de facto, from the Franks. This would be the case also later, that most of these this region was intermittently under the rule of whichever was ruling in the northeast, in the Frankish heartland, but going back and forth and still ruling on the basis of the local autonomies, say the local communities that remain autonomous. Felix's successor was known as Lupus, and he held still loose ties with the Frankish kings. Of course, they didn't want to be completely cut out from the system, because it was still a way to be legitimized within the Frankish empire in a way or another. In fact, Lupus was recognized as princeps of Aquitaine, so ruling autonomously by being recognized as the first among equals in Aquitaine. Consider that Aquitaine was much less, let's say, socially stratified on average than Francia proper. In other words, per capita wealth was higher, wealth was more evenly distributed, and this is a bit true for the entire Occitania, right? We shouldn't think that, again, Aquitanian culture wasn't lordly, or that actually by Gallic standards, let's say by Anglo-Saxon standards, Longobarд standards, it was actually quite stratified, right, already. There were large estates, powerful individuals, and so on, but not as much as the Frankish world, or even Burgundy, for example. This favored a more civil development from one side, but also kind of restrained the potential, for example, as far as the private retinues of mounted armored forces, like the ones that the Franks were quite gradually but still consistently developing in a never more martial sense. In fact, Aldo succeeded Lupus in 700 and signed a peace treaty with Charles Martel that by that point was, as majordome of Palace, was actually carrying out a wide process of political reconstruction under his family, by still exploiting the Merovingians, again, were sacred in blood, and the entire mystique of the French monarchy was already there. Through that the Carolingians simply limited themselves to take literally every single Merovingian thing that was already there before Carolingian times and making it their own later. But again, the nobility of blood was and the sacrality of blood, especially in Francia, was a big deal. One of the most important objectives of we will see it now, of the Carolingians, was the one of recovering, of course, this broader Frankish empire, and at that point also trying to dislodge properly all those dynasties that had been forming locally on a lay, but sometimes also especially in southern France, in southern Gaul, in an ecclesiastical fashion. I made a video about in fact, Merovingian and geography, and there is a bit that dichotomy explained between the north and the south. South was, as we've seen, more fragmented, so less politically cohesive, but it was also very already encastled by a degree. Every place had maintained, say, the local deities from pagan times that had become Christian saints in the meanwhile, and the church, like in the strongest Roman urban tradition, had maintained really great power. So when the Carolingians, and they had started behaving literally as Frankish counts, they had married into them in part from their episcopal and Gallo-Roman senatorial background, and simply becoming to usurp the Merovingian, and so those would have become Carolingian by papal blessing territories, right? By simply expanding, becoming the de facto lords of the area. And so Charles Martel was much involved there to retake this politically fragmented and importantly rich south by also confiscating lots of ecclesiastical possessions. Were quite large and powerful, so you didn't have to imagine a poor priest working his little garden and then the terrible Austrasian giant horsemen arrive and start making wah and taking away the bread out of his mouth and, stealing cattle, the few chickens is too much. No, we are talking about, I say this because eventually this southern Gauls will leave a very bad press, right, say parchment, written parchment on Charles Martel for this reason, but actually we're talking about substantial clashes also by the armed retinues of these bishops and people that eventually were to make up the Carolingian Empire itself, but that up to that point had been living not really differently from how the Gallo-Roman senators, just from which they descended, had always been living with, even after the Franks had arrived, they had married into them. So it's another phase, and Aquitaine represents a bit that kind of, say, that political and social side, a little also the attrition on a larger regional scale between the Carolingians now and the Aquitanians look like this. Now, Otto the Great, as you know, is called like this because he succeeded in inflicting a defeat on the Muslims at the Battle of Toulouse in 721, right? Just 10 years prior, the Iberian Peninsula had fallen to the Arabs, to the Arab Berbers, let's put it this way, that now were swarming into southern Gaul, and Aquitaine was major bulwark capable of, checking the Pyrenean passes, or at least, giving battle to the larger Muslim armies that were able to cross. This included naturally a lot of political gaining and even alliance with the Muslims, because, as you know, the Emirate Caliphate of Cordoba was actually the most politically concentrated power in Western Europe at that point, but it had difficulties in controlling the northern frontier, so there were also other Islamic rulers that were a bit, treacherous. That northern frontier had always been that unstable. Charles Martel was coveting Aquitaine, to make the long story short, so much so that he didn't, make himself too much scruple to cross the Loire in 731 and looting much of Aquitaine. Right now 731, considering what would happen the following year, should make you understand here what happened, because Otto engaged the Carolingian in battle, but lost and came out weakened. And as a consequence, the Arabs invaded Vasconia and Aquitaine in 732. At that point, Otto had no chance to withstand this invasion alone, as he had been doing prior, because it had been literally depleted by the Franks. So he was obliged to call Charles Martel to crush the Arabs. Right. In fact, Otto had given them battle in the same 732. Once he was defeated twice, right, near Bordeaux. He had been eventually ousted from his own country, so the Arabs were just launching, in fact, this raids up to far in the Loire. So as you know, that climatic battle between Charles Martel and the Arabs, in which the latter were crushed to actually just back down from occupying Aquitaine in its entirety, like pushing the boundary up to the Loire, but not from actually keeping to invade southern Gaul, Provence, Septimania, and so on. This was a big deal, right? Because arguably the greatest accomplishment there was not just defeating the Arabs in battle, but managing to cash Aquitaine in one shot, right? Because literally the Aquitanians at that point couldn't defend themselves anymore. They returned under Frankish protection. Naturally, the Frankish military machine at that point was really evolving towards something that could, in fact, impersonate the prior, let's say, previous Frankish prestige, even though it would take generations, right? And it's just under Charles' grandson, Charles, right, Charlemagne, that things would go to the utmost extent. Aldo was succeeded by his son Hunald in Aquitaine. In fact, Charles Martel didn't really, force hand too much, because Aquitaine was dangerous when put under too much pressure. And Hunald unavoidably ended up trying to reacquire the former Aquitanian independence, defying the mayor of Pallas. The Carolingian leader thus attacked Hunald twice in 735 and 36, but was unable to totally subdue the Duke. And an army put together by counts of key Aquitanian towns, especially Bourges, Limoges. And this shows pretty well how, yes, you could quite say the Carolingian power was very well oiled and steamrolling, but it was also designed for this great Atlantic plains of northern France, and also further towards Central Europe, where there wasn't so much urbanization. There were important vestiges of also the Roman past that the Merovingians had been kept colonizing Germany, other places, and so on. But at this point, still the Carolingian army has to develop that punching capacity to be able to knock down significantly fortified areas, especially acting as a sort of league here. Poitiers, Bourges, Toulouse, Agen. There are really lots of important centers that also are tactically balanced. They have more infantry, surely at least better drilled and equipped one than another one, etc. The future here, exclusively thanks to the Franks, well, not as such, but at least with them pioneering the thing, was the predominance of heavy cavalry that also in Aquitaine was actually the norm by this time, except infantry until essentially the mid-12th century was still capable of holding successfully its ground against cavalry charges. So this Aquitanian force shows a bit as a civilization on its own, opposed to the northern Franks, also on the battlefield. Right? It's tiring. Maybe that they cannot withstand the powerful Carolingian cavalry charges. There are really something already at this point, but in open field. But when there is to storm a city and to block all those horses, by the way, with all the logistics, the hygiene problems, and so on, it becomes really a challenge. And arguably, it's through this seasonal warfare, yearly warfare, this uninterrupted activity from the side of the Franks to really wage war against the different people every year, so much that the monks in their annals would write only the year in which there hadn't been an expedition, because the other was not really news, right? Are just developing at this point those massive logistical capabilities that would be available, in fact, a couple of generations later for, crossing the Alps with a joint operation, besieging Pavia for 9 months, taking out with a massive strategic amphibious operation the other Khaganate in Pannonia. So, peoples grow over time, usually. Hunald, the successor of Aldo the Great, however, at some point retired to a monastery, leaving both the rule and actually the continuing conflict with Weifer. Following the full occupation of Septimania in 759, Pepin the Short, the son of Charles Martel, turned now his attention to the bulk of Aquitaine. Right, the Franks had been passing south, mostly through Burgundy. That was part, in a sense, of their militarized heartland. It could, at this point, the Carolingian power is mostly a Frankish-Burgundian thing. I made a video also about this, and decided to knock out the entirety of Aquitaine. Right, and they managed to do so with a non-stop cyclical military campaign lasting for 8 years. Right, they kept hammering Aquitaine, town after town, for 8 years in a row. Right, and this tells you again what the massive resources the Carolingians were able to put together, the moral force, the agricultural output of this massive and enormous Atlantic plains in northwestern Europe. They really were something that would open even to the further based ones of Aquitaine up to the Pyrenees. So Weifer at this point kept equally defending in a strenuous way against the Carolingians, but he was assassinated in 768, a blow from which Aquitanian politics never really recovered from. The full direct occupation of this land was not possible, right? So a degree of autonomy was maintained. However, this is the moment in which the Carolingians managed to assert their control, their authority, their command, their rule, their power over Aquitaine. Right? This was deeply felt by the population. Right. In fact, during the previous campaigns, especially, Aquitaine had been devastated. Right, the cities, say the agricultural activities, trade, had been really destroyed in large part. The military resources, manpower, demography had been spent. Also, the intellectual centers that had been already flourishing at that point had been largely put down. Remember the aforementioned confiscation of ecclesiastical monastic property. Well, Pepin is estimated to have destroyed up to 36 monasteries in Aquitaine, right? In order properly to eradicate all those, little lords that could altogether just gather forces, and that he went to take out of their nests one by one. That's much of what a meat grinder these Carolingian expeditions were. How much of a slaughtering machine really the Frankish army had become. So the cultural profile of Aquitaine again is fascinating, because together with the Visigothic experience that lasted in the very southernmost areas we've seen even up to 721, right? Even before the Arabs arrived in the northeasternmost parts of the Visigothic kingdom, that were in fact in Gaul. It took 10 years from the fall of Toledo, from the destruction of the Visigothic monarchy. So Toulouse would remain mostly in the hands of the Aquitanians. This had brought the land to fundamentally inherit Visigothic law that, as we have seen very often together with the Burgundian one, was the most radically Romanized Germanic one. And that bore the trace, again, of that kind of particular social background that was more present, again, in this deeply Romanized areas, especially of southern Gaul and parts of Spain, especially southern Spain, northeastern Spain. This is usually remembered, allowed more juridical autonomy to women, right? Particularly with the Liber Judiciorum that we have seen the other day in the video about medieval Catalonia. That would become the base of the local constitutions. That had been codified back in Visigothic times between 642, 43, things like that, expanding on the Code of Rexisvent in 653. Women could inherit a substantial amount of land, even title, to manage autonomously from their husbands or male protectors, as was in the Germanic law, this property. It wasn't, again, a radical departure from the actual patriarchal system that people would like to make you believe, right? It was never... It's since the Bronze Age that there is not a matriarchal rule in Europe anywhere, right? And these were rigidly patriarchal systems, saying Roman ones really were. But the, say, greater per capita wealth availability had just brought... This is true also if you look at the Lombard law, that is much more rigidly patriarchal than these other ones, but much more hardcore Germanic. But still, you see in Italy under the same law, women, being able to enjoy part of these properties and so on. What seems to stand out, however, is that differently from Italy and, say, Britain, etc., the Visigothic law, a bit like, as it was in the case in southern France as well, mirrored the permanence of the large estates, right, of Roman times. A larger, at least it was a stronger sort of nobility that could, plus also for dynastic reasons, maintain also a female succession, or at least some kind of, as we've seen, female autonomy that was more important for the sake of this big clans, right, to arrange things like, right. Other laws were much more nuclear, right, much more restricted family groups by a degree, or at least some that would take matters just in their own hand without needing this more civil intervention, even from the state, from however the system really worked, right? So even the fact that, I don't know, women could dispose their property in legal wills if they had no heirs, right? It's still, it's a big deal for those times in terms of women's right, but it's also still very normally in the, again, this was not a feministic society for sure, nor it could ever be, fortunately enough. Women could represent themselves, for example, and bear witness in court by age 14, interestingly enough. They could arrange for their own marriages around the age of 20 again, but still within, however, a normally Romano-Germanic patriarchal system, which remained the norm absolutely throughout all these areas for European identity. Part of, as we've seen, the Salians would exclude female inheritance to core, right? Even here, actually, the concept is more subtle than, again, it actually seems. Don't make it look as if women really had, like they were free or normally or roaming around. This doesn't exist in any place in Europe, right? Because society worked in a very specific way, functionally speaking, and there was no room for this other BS, right? Like people think that, I don't know, Viking women were free and all this BS. That it's the diametrically opposite reality from anybody who has studied anything from Germanistics or history of law. In any case, surely from a Frankish perspective, this kind of Visigothic custom was looking more effeminate, right? And again, the idea that this kind of bit exotic, sensual, decadent south, where it was in the mind of these people. So like the Franks were the chosen people. They thought they were the only people chosen by God to rule over the entire world, and that the Romans had somehow decayed. And so it was their turn to take the Imperium and to control these other places. So that was more or less the mindset. So this autonomous as troublesome Duchy of Aquitaine was conquered by the Franks in 769 after a series of revolts against their suzerainty had been flaring and being put down, however. In order to avoid a new demonstration of Aquitanian, autonomy, Charlemagne decided to organize further the land within his kingdom. The Franks really cared about Aquitaine for this reason, because again, it was just a very important landmass just close to their own heartland. It was relatively sheltered from from enemy. I mean, from one side you have the ocean, from another you have the Loire and the Franks themselves, then the Pyrenees. At best, there can be the Arabs or the Basques that harass you with raids and so on. But say they're also very much frontier areas, so you can control. If you do control these places, you can really extend your rule over a significant amount of towns that are going to remain, trading, working, providing you with human and material resources. When the Carolingians conquered Aquitaine, the duchy was thus dissolved, right? The powers were taken over by the local counts. At times they could be called also dukes, right, of this, but they're smaller provincial entities, right? For example, the ones of Toulouse was, however, still the most significant center, and in fact, main seat of Carolingian government, also because it was strategically connected with, again, the watershed there between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic side. It was relatively close to just the Pyrenees, could intervene from a relatively sheltered position in Septimania against the Arab raid. So it was really could easily access again the Garonne Valley and so on. So it really had a meaning, but there were other centers around. The local official put by Charlemagne was Corso, that was, however, deposed, because again, the local officials would still, however, rebel, because the local communities would try to win them over and trying to tickle their political ambitions, personally speaking. So Charlemagne sent there a trustee known as William, that was actually a close relative of the other. And in 781, Charlemagne made his third son, the future Louis the Pious, as a matter of fact, then only 3 years old, King of Aquitaine. This is how important he considered the realm, because one heir had to be properly ruling from the Frankish earthland, then one, as we've seen, from the Italic kingdom necessarily. But Aquitaine was immediately third in importance. Of course, the kingdom was subordinated to the Carolingian, at that time still king, and later emperor, right? So the term rex, as you know, in Latin, can mean just one king, right, and not the entire rigid hierarchy as such, but at least over time, in the same Carolingian, post-Carolingian feudalism, that would become the normal order of importance. So whoever ruled over Austrasia and Neustria would then naturally also try to control Aquitaine with a direct, with a close element, either a relative or another trustee, and so on. This kingdom of Aquitaine did not include only, as we've seen, the properly Aquitanian hinterland, but also Gothia, Vasconia, and importantly enough, the Carolingian possessions in Spain as well, because as we've seen, there had been some counties that had been formed in the broader market of Spain that prove again that in the region the Franks were more powerful than the Arabs, and would hopefully kind of block any kind of attempt of further invasion there. In 806, also Charlemagne planned to divide his empire between the sons, and Louis the Pious received Provence and Burgundy as additions to his Aquitanian kingdom. So this strengthened further his position in Gaul, because he basically controlled the entire central southern Gaul. Like that, it was a hell of a power. When Louis succeeded his father as emperor after his death in 814, he immediately granted Aquitaine to his son Pepin I. I made a video about this specifically about the instructions of Charlemagne to his heir. And Pepin I died in 838, so that the nobility of Aquitaine chose Pepin's son, his homonymous Pepin II, the king thus of Aquitaine. He would die in 865. The Emperor Louis, however, opposed such arrangement because it was not in his plans really, and these children were often prey of the local nobility. They always tried to autonomize themselves. Again, they were generally speaking part of the Frankish Empire, and they were heavily influenced by Frankish culture in general. It's just that, again, that's a bit the reason why the Carolingian Empire would fall. Everybody wanted to just go their own way, right, to maintain at least their own prerogatives locally without having to respond to a bigger power if this didn't have the force to really co-opt them and, giving them something in exchange, right? So Louis the Pious, however, gave the kingdom to his youngest son Charles, which is also quite interesting. And this is the future Charles the Bald, who will rule as emperor, and especially from the Western Frankish side. This switch, however, created some political engulfment that eventually fell in favor of Charles, right? Anyway, from 845 to 852, Pepin II was, however, in possession of the kingdom. At Eastertide 848 in Limoges, the magnates and prelates of Aquitaine formally elected him as their king, right? So still showing that they didn't want to obey Louis that simply. Later, the same Charles was anointed at Orléans, so that was actually within the Frankish kind of orbit, the Franco-Burgundian world in a sense, and so even more politically important, and even crowned by Benliot, who was the Archbishop of Sens. In 852, however, Pepin II was imprisoned by Charles the Bald, who also at that point had risen to power, and that pronounced his own son Charles as the rule of Aquitaine instead. This younger Charles died in 866, so that his brother Louis the Stammerer succeeded to the kingdom. Right, these were also the intricacies of the Carolingian dynasty. But once you learn them, like everything flows smoothly. Really, he would be the father of Charles the Simple, and so on. So it's a bit of an interesting context here, because the empire is falling apart, and especially Gaul, as such, where all these autonomies would at some point explode exactly in these years. And Louis is important in this because not just he was Aquitanian king, but because in 877 became king of the Western Franks himself. As a consequence, for a little while, there was yet another, say, communion of the Frankish and the Aquitanian crowns. Now, according to a treaty made in 845 between Charles the Bald and Pepin II, the Aquitanian kingdom had been essentially stripped of the important lands of Poitou, Saintonge, and Angoumois, right? So mostly in the periphery, right? And trying again to partition it in a way to dilute its power in Gaul as a unitary polity. And at this point, the Aquitanian duke was sort of this kind of smaller heartland that would, in a sense, remain at the core of the feudal one, that would still re-expand this his dominion over these lands during the High Middle Ages, was Rheinolf. Albeit such ducal title was claimed also by the Count of Toulouse, which tells you how fragmented the situation was, even for the bigger chunks, right, of the of the kingdoms. Like Charles the Bald had issued the Capitulary of Quercy-sur-Loise that sanctioned the inheritance of the larger fiefs, and so everybody was really running for these ones. But the truth is that already the smaller ones, and especially in Gaul, had been simply privatizing dramatically to the point of non-return that at least would have taken centuries before the Western Frankish kings could have done something about. Consider that still at this point, against the 845 agreement, the Dukes of Aquitaine still claimed Poitou, Saintonge, and the Angoumois to be part of their own territory, right? So as far as they were going, that was still, a unique thing, and was surely some political cohesion, in spite of the general fragmentation, still a sense of belonging, identity again. Now, Reinulf would essentially give birth, literally, to his successors, right, on the throne of Aquitaine. In spite of all these Frankish complaints, the hatred was ferocious, such as in 893 when the Count Reinulf II was poisoned by the order of Charles III, Charles the Fat. And Charles, on that occasion, because they tried periodically to basically retain Aquitaine with expeditions, with revolt, triggering revolts, and so on. I think it was really messy because the Vikings were arriving in the meanwhile. By the way, there were some local counts that played against the entire system. So just this situation miserably reflected the degree of disorder that had been falling under those very years in Western Francia. However, at the death of Reinulf II, Charles III bestowed the duchy upon William the Pious, Count of Auvergne, who is historically famous, if anything, because of the foundation of the Abbey of Cluny. Right, so that tells you also the scale of even the power, the wealth of the local magnates that, by the way, during Carolingian times had become way more powerful than they had been before. It was a way just for the Franks to co-opt people faraway places, but really there were powerful lords already there. And William was succeeded by his nephew in 918, the Count William II, Count of Auvergne and Duke of Aquitaine, who died in 926. So here we are going beyond, of course, the Carolingians. So a succession of Dukes of Aquitaine followed naturally, one of whom, William IV, fought even against Hugh Capet, right? That, as you know, essentially descending from the Robertian branch of the Counts of Paris, managed to refound a substantially strong Western Frankish monarchy, right, and beginning very gradually to reaffirm it on the surrounding land, right. William V of Aquitaine was able to consolidate his domains and extending them considerably. He was so powerful in post-Carolingian Europe that he was even offered the Lombard crown, right? And he refused it because this would have entailed to fight against the King of Germany, Conrad II, for it. But it tells you again how relevant still the Aquitanians were after all the various turmoils, transitions, so on, as a regional scale power. William V's duchy almost reached, in fact, the prior boundaries of the old Roman Gallia Aquitania. However, it did not stretch on the say the left bank of the Garonne River. That was kind of a not really off-limit area, but again, the Basques were doing pretty bad stuff there, let's say, at least as far as the Aquitanian interests were concerned. In fact, the Gascons, generally speaking, retained control of the area. William V died in 1030, right? So there would be a bit more of history in between, but roughly, we have eventually Aldo of Aquitaine, who managed to resume some control on Gascony. He died in 1039. By this point, the Ramnul fits that we have seen being established since Carolingian times had definitely become the dominant dynasty in southwestern Gaul, right? By the end of the 11th century, their power really stretched across this vast area that remained still quite autonomous from the rest of France, albeit starting to re-enter at least the royal policy on a bigger level. These are the years of the Crusades. There are, major openings to new say levels of growth, of intellectual development, economic growth. Not everything was going so smoothly, because especially in this land, as we've seen, it's so composite, and it's also relatively polycentric, even though it's a term that I really detest. The emergence of this wealth was unprecedented, and it would create, think about the heresies, think about, we see it in the county of Toulouse as some sort of, at the end of the day, relatively functional hybrid between, say, a comital and a communal power, right? In any case, Aquitaine, say the Aquitanian core land was really also very compact area after all, and therefore could exercise this power around. By marriage, rather than conquest, the Aquitanian possessions passed, famously enough, as we were saying before, into the Angevin Empire, right? So this de facto is under the English crown by 1153. William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, who died in 1127, had succeeded to the dukedom in 1087, so substantially long rule for the time, gained fame as a crusader, right? And also as a troubadour. This is very important because, again, the idea of males in the peak of their say violence are also in the one of their creativity, and the Aquitanians pass via, again, hot blood and some kind of, again, sensually and pleasure oriented individuals as a stereotype, right? And William IX's granddaughter would be the famous Eleanor of Aquitaine, right, who succeeded the Aquitanian duchy as the eldest daughter and heiress of William X, her father, in 1137, right? So this inheritance, as we've seen, for especially at such high level, was particularly important to channel even through female inheritance, again, in differently from the rest of the kingdom, such such enormous assets and wealth, power, and so on. Eleanor had a brother who would have to succeed naturally in her stead, but he did not, as sadly enough, considerable part of the infants at the time past childhood. He died before. Eleanor married at that point. She was quite young. Also very young King Louis, right? At least the junior king of France, the future Louis VII. Just 3 months after Eleanor's father had died, right? And this marriage was destined, as you know, not to succeed. We cannot enter in the broader political tensions that were going on at the time, between especially the Capetians and the house of of Blois. However, the union had been probably thought of like so rashly. They were two kids essentially. Admittedly, at the time, people aged faster, right? But Louis VI, Prince Louis' father, had probably not wanted to leave such a precious land like Aquitaine, ruled by, again, a girl who could simply be at that point controlled by the nobility. So the thing was not even poorly thought as such, but like the unpredictability of it all was really complicated. Consider that when the Louis VII rose to the throne, the Duchy of Aquitaine officially came under the rule of the French crown, right? So there were many wars going on, and naturally it was very difficult to control this territory effectively, right? The marriage lasted for a substantial amount of time, after all, 15 years, and during which surely the aggrandizement of the French crown was carried out further. The idea that we often say for the Angevin Empire, that simply this would make the English be more powerful, at least as for this dynastic sum of fiefs than the French king, is true. But at the same time, right, these territories were there, right, and for a while they had been part of the French crown as well. The marriage between Eleanor and Louis was later annulled on the grounds of consanguinity by a bishop on March the 21st, 1152. Louis actually agreed to this. There are stories about this. Again, the stereotype is that the monarch was very, almost wholly spiritually oriented. He wore the shillitchum, things like that, while Eleanor was apparently quite, again, playing up the stereotype of sensuality, and she had lovers and things like that. In any case, she would famously also remain not just Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, during the marriage, but remarrying on the same year, May the 18th, 1152, with Henry II of England, right? At least at the time he wasn't king himself. However, he would become shortly, and this would increase dramatically the power of the Angevins that had just won basically this terrible civil war that had been shattering England for a considerable amount of time, just also the French interlanding part. Henry was the son of Empress Matilda, so called because she had priorly married with also the Holy Roman Emperor, and Henry rose to power when he defeated his mother's cousin, Stephen of Blois, right, in 1153, becoming properly King of England, and Aquitaine, again, merging with the English crown. So, basically starting a hell of a power. I also made a video about, again, Angevin England that illustrates a bit also the events of the continent, given that the most important, say, English possessions were still French, and the same monarchs were French. At the end of the day, they would speak French more than they would do English, and they would also spend a considerable amount of time, preferentially also the majority of the noblemen, in their ancestral domains across the Channel. Henry naturally had to struggle for maintaining control of all this a huge domain, right? He made dramatic improvements. He also somehow tried just to standardize government by degree. Aquitaine arguably helped exactly because it was a more kind of civil rather than feudally oriented possession. So there were some things that were even important in terms of administration, model of government, even just the prestige from the southern land, the arts, the singers, and so on. Aquitaine did rebel. At a point, Henry put down such a rise and gave Aquitaine to his son Richard, the Lion Earth, that he had with Eleanor, together with other children, in fact. And when Richard died in 1199, after, again, made videos on that, extraordinary existence, and dying actually reached by his mother Eleanor during his, his demise due to a crossbow bolt at a siege. Aquitaine reverted to Eleanor, right? And on her death, 5 years later, the country was reabsorbed into the English crown. The thing went on for at least as long as the other son of Eleanor, John, would maintain a substantial control of France, and therefore mostly the power over Normandy and Anjou. Right. This is until Bouvines the main problem. Really, as we've seen, John had quite a lot of troubles, but he almost managed to knock out the Capetians, and he should be, tributed much greater credit than he's usually done as monarch, and managing to remain in power for all the things that happened at that point. So all this huge territory, after all, had been just proving to be absorbed by other rulers, other powers. Like Aquitaine started losing a bit her own through independence. The Capetians were becoming very strong. Aquitaine and all her dependencies had not been developing as a unitary power. It doesn't matter how large it was and how powerful and rich, whatever. Still, the difference politically and institutionally with the kingdoms of France, at least in which Aquitaine was, but was being revived feudally under the Capetians, and the one of England were the only powers there that could really maintain it in efficiency, right? So this would be at the base of the eventually even the same 100 Years' War later on. This requires quite a big jump up to 1337, when King Philip the Sixth of France reclaimed Aquitaine as a French fief. Right at this point, Aquitaine had been much reduced because, from English possession, because most of the other territories in the hinterland had been essentially absorbed by the French monarchy, right? So again, I'm talking nationally, but you understand what I mean. I mean, these were all kind of different territories. The English had a control on the territories as essentially French vassals, except the 100 Years' War brought to another level, because at that point it was the English claiming the French throne, and so making even more leverage for many other reasons that I made multiple videos on the 100 Years' War. We don't have time to digress on the causes and the reasons that were also connected with other and more important places. In any case, Aquitaine at this point, what we mean by that is the Guyenne, from the deformation of the country's name. Again, this had remained practically in the hands of the English, but much reduced, right, especially in the hinterland. And Philip VI thought well to ask back this fief to to Edward III of England. At that point, Edward was claiming the entire Kingdom of France as the only grandson of Philip IV, the Fair. So this and other reasons again triggered the 100 Years' War, right, in which both the Plantagenets and the House of Valois, at that point was still a branch of the Capetians, but it were always the same kings till the end of the French monarchy, claimed supremacy over Aquitaine as well. This was important because, essentially, from Aquitaine and the ports, especially the port of Bordeaux, the English could enter some importantly developed areas of southern France that at that time were undergoing a crisis, also because of the beginning of the war, but that were substantially far from the French center of power in the north, right? Especially during the potential English invasion from the north, which did occur as well. Plus, the English were blowing on the embers, burning still under the ashes of what had been this prior Occitanian war that by now had simply collapsed to the French stern northerners, right? That had really established, as you know, in the 13th century after Bouvines, this the greatest power in Europe, and therefore consolidating step by step their territorial domination of France, and so therefore agglutinating and concentrating under their power all these more peripheral areas. The Count of Toulouse had been de facto destroyed during the Albigensian Crusade, even though it was absorbed by the Capetians only later on. So the area had really received the full brunt of some of the basically the strongest army in Europe at the time, and had never quite recovered from it. It would be, I made videos, again, at this point I can't finally say during my videos every 3 seconds, I made videos about that because I really made lots of them also about the Albigensians, so if you're interested, you know where to search. There is even a playlist about the Albigensian Crusade and heresy and so on, so it had been a major French papal victory over this area that, identically speaking, this kind of Occitanian, Visigothic kind of sounding, and still somehow different looking country, in many ways had lost, right, to the most militarized imperialistic north, and had paid actually for its fragmentation, for the fact that it had never been able to give itself more unitary asset, right, and one that could be substantially maintained, right. This balance had been arguably broken already at the time of the 8th century, but it was especially evident at that point. The only ones, again, that could have kind of subverted the thing would have been the same Angevins, but still within a French monarchy, right? So really it was a very long-term process. Now, in 1360, both the Plantagenets and the Valois signed the Treaty of Brittany, in which, given how the war had been going, Edward III renounced the French crown, just temporarily. However, was recognized as the sovereign Lord of Aquitaine, right? This was the real title, not merely Duke, right? They cared about stressing the fact that they were lords of this land. There was some kind of, at this point, supranational and still dynastic control over that territory, so even from the outside, from across the sea. However, this treaty would be broken just 9 years later because the English, in fact, were not content just with that. In 1362, Edward, as Lord of Aquitaine, made his eldest son, Edward, Prince of Wales, Prince of Aquitaine, right? We've seen that the same battle Poitiers that I made a video about in 1356, where the Black Prince won. In fact, the French and captured the same John, the king. Their same king John II was fought in the territory of the broader Aquitaine during this chevauchée across the entire France, mostly in the south, where that was very difficult just to defend from the north, especially if you had Gascony, where simply the English ships could land there, even though most of the forces used were Gascons, also from the English side, right? So it's great stretches of land, lots of resources, a lot of people, right? By the way, are terrorized by the English chevauchée that cause a massive structural and systemic damage, and this already tells you. But we are in the second half of the 14th century. The great medieval civilization has already contracted brusquely. So, what the English were trying to do at this point is proper English rather than French. Were simply gaining as much as they could from these peripheral areas where you could score a victory, even a big one like the ones of the 100 Years' War, but you would never know how things would go on the longer run. So, cash there and now. Think about how they looted Carcassonne and some of the other very large southern French territories. And as you understand, there was also kind of like the break of a broader Aquitanian feeling at that point. Just culturally, as an Occitanian land, it could be seen, but it's just like, I don't know, Normandy that at this point starts getting tired of paying the tributes for war to the English and starts shifting towards French allegiance, right, in spite of its autonomy. So I made a video about the Duchy of Normandy as well. Again, there is a medieval French playlist. You can find all the stuff there, including this video. In 1390, the son of Edward, the Black Prince, the King Richard II of England, appointed his uncle, the son of Edward III, John of Gaunt, Duke of Aquitaine, just for, the sake of, we will talk about Richard II, but, it's how they administered this areas in different ways. This brought essentially the ascendancy of John of Gaunt to maintain the duchy, the ducal title, albeit they still belonged to the English crown, at least from an English perspective. John of Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, managed with a coup, right, to usurp the crown, same crown from Richard II, right? So this brought to the even at a personal dynastic level, the reinjection of the lordship of Aquitaine into properly the English ruling line, right? And this, in fact, brought Henry to Henry IV of England, by the way, to pass the title down to his descendants, his son Henry V of England, that ruled over Aquitaine as Kingdom of England and Lord of Aquitaine. The titles were still distinguished naturally. He kept them from 1400 to 1422. Now, we don't have to present Henry V. It's one of the single most famous characters in medieval history. I still have to make a video about the Battle of Azincourt, 1415, but we'll hopefully get to that point. Henry succeeded finally in obtaining the French crown for his family by the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. However, he died 2 years later. His son Henry VI was just a baby at that point, less than 1 year old. So even though he nominally inherited the French throne, what really happened from this time afterwards is that the French still retained control of the French heartland. They began to re-expand and to drive out the English, famously enough. So this would mean on the longer run Aquitaine falling again, and for good, as we will see now, into French hands. naturally, the Valois claimed the same right, the supremacy over Aquitaine, historically, just aside from the treaties that they would have to sign for political and strategic necessity, but they would use during the war and this alternating moments of French or English possession of the land to grant the title of Duke of Aquitaine to their heirs, the Dauphins. Some of which were not yet called such because the Dauphinate was to be inherited. I made a couple of videos about the Dauphinate if you're interested as well. During this time span goes from 1345 and 1450. We're talking about John II, John the Good, the one captured at Poitiers in 1356. Ruled from, in fact, in Aquitaine, at least from 1345 to 1350. Charles VII, who ruled from 1392 to 1401. Louis, that was never actually king of France because he died 17 during a war to resume his control. He was at the age of 12 children of Charles VI. And Isabeau of Bavaria. But at least between 1401 and 1415, he had the title of Duke of Aquitaine. The French won the 100 Years' War at the Battle of Castillon in 1453. Nominally, the two countries would remain at war for another couple of decades, but the most relevant thing is that England wouldn't resume any other substantial offensive, also because the country was engulfed in the Wars of the Roses. So while the 100 Years' War terminated formally in 1475 with the Treaty of Picquigny, Aquitaine returned under the direct rule of the King of France significantly earlier, remaining essentially in the possession of the king as such. Only occasionally was the title of Duke of Aquitaine granted to another member of the French royal family, but like other ones, this didn't correspond anymore to a significant political territorial identity of the country as such. These were feudal possessions. Now the King of France, sure, there was a local nobility, a local autonomy, but the days of glory of this land were really over. Right. Naturally, the history of Aquitaine is much more complex than what I said today. It's just a brief sketch of how the duchy was done and undone practically. But we will hopefully talk about the country again in another video. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.